You wake up, but you can't move. There's a heavy, suffocating pressure crushing your chest. Through the terrifying paralysis, you sense a figure lurking in the corner of your vision. You try to scream, but not a sound comes out. We have a name for that now: sleep paralysis. We see it as a fascinating but ultimately harmless glitch in our neurology, where the mind wakes up before the body does. We use science to explain it. We talk about autonia and hypnagogic hallucinations. But just for a moment, imagine you lived in a world without that scientific framework. Imagine you believed this wasn't a trick of the mind, but a literal, physical assault. For people in the Middle Ages, this wasn't just a possibility, it was real. This experience, this suffocating terror in the dead of night, was proof of something far more sinister. It wasn't a dream. It was a demon in your bedroom, and it had a name: the Incubus. Let's uncover the terrifying world of medieval bedroom demons and explore how a simple nightmare, a sexual dream, or a moment of paralysis was once seen as a literal brush with hell itself. To understand the sheer terror of a midnight visitor, we first have to step inside the medieval mind. This was a world lit by fire and faith, where the veil between our world and the supernatural was thin, almost transparent. God and his angels were everywhere, but so were Satan and his legions. And these weren't just ideas or metaphors. They were seen as real, tangible forces that meddled in daily life. A sudden illness, a failed crop, a stillborn child. Any of it could be the work of demonic mischief. The devil and his servants didn't stay in hell. They walked the earth, constantly looking for ways to tempt, torment, and drag human souls down to damnation. In this world, the most vulnerable time for anyone was the night. When the sun went down and the world was plunged into a darkness we can barely imagine today, the bedroom became a battleground. Sleep, a state where you weren't fully conscious or in control, left your soul exposed. And it was in this defenseless state that two specific kinds of demons were thought to launch their most intimate and terrifying attacks: the Incubus and the Succubus. These weren't just any evil spirits. They were specialists whose entire purpose was to have sex with sleeping mortals. The name Incubus comes from the Latin incubare, meaning to lie upon, a chillingly direct description of the crushing weight victims felt. The Succubus comes from succubare, meaning to lie under, reflecting its role in seducing men. For medieval people, the strange and often frightening things that happen in our sleep, paralysis, vivid sexual dreams, nocturnal emissions, weren't coming from inside their own minds. They were external attacks, physical violations by beings from another world, whose goals ranged from simple lustful corruption to something far more horrifying: creating monstrous children. This wasn't just a scary story. It was a deeply held belief, debated by the most brilliant theologians of the age, and it gripped the minds of everyone from the poorest peasant to the most educated cleric. The Incubus was the very image of a malevolent nightly assault. It was the demon that preyed on women, and it was the terrifying answer to what we now call sleep paralysis. Picture a woman in a medieval village. She goes to sleep after a long day of hard labor, and in the dead of night, she jolts awake. She can see her small, dark room, but her body is locked in place. She can't move a finger, can't turn her head, can't scream for help. Then, the pressure starts. A crushing weight on her chest makes it hard to breathe. And in the shadows, or maybe right there, on top of her, she sees a figure, a man, a creature, something dark and horrifying. Today, a neurologist would explain this as REM autonia and a hypnagogic hallucination. But to this woman, the explanation was much simpler and far more terrifying. An incubus was on her. The very word nightmare comes from this belief. The mare wasn't a horse, but an evil spirit, a goblin or demon that sat on a sleeper's chest and crushed them. The attack wasn't just about terror, it was explicitly sexual. Theologians and writers recorded countless stories of these assaults. They were described as violations, often violent and always terrifying, that left the victim feeling both physically and spiritually dirty. Some sources even claimed the demon's body was unnaturally cold. But what did the incubus want? Medieval thinkers debated this intensely. On one level, the goal was simple temptation. As agents of Satan, these demons were sent to lead humanity into sin. By forcing a sexual act, the incubus tainted the victim with lust, a deadly sin that could put her immortal soul in danger. For a woman, especially in a society that prized female piety and chastity above all, an experience like this could be devastating, filling her with shame and fear of damnation, even though she didn't consent. But some theologians proposed a more complex and sinister purpose, one that tried to answer a disturbing question. Could demons have children? Thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wrestled with this. Since demons were spiritual beings, they were believed to be sterile. They couldn't create life. So how could they get human women pregnant? This led to a horrifyingly clever theory. The demon would first appear as a succubus, a female demon, and visit a sleeping man to collect his semen. Then, the same demon would shape-shift into an incubus, visit a sleeping woman, and deposit the stolen seed into her, causing a pregnancy. This chilling theory meant the child was technically human, but its conception was the work of demonic trickery, a twisting of the sacred act of procreation. This belief became an explanation for all sorts of things. Children born with severe deformities or disabilities were sometimes whispered to be the result of such a union. And it wasn't just the poor and unfortunate who were linked to this lore. Maybe the most famous person said to be fathered by an incubus was the legendary wizard Merlin. In many versions of the Arthurian legends, his mother was a good woman who was tricked and impregnated by a demon, which explained his incredible magical powers. This turned the incubus from a simple nighttime pest into a being that could change the course of human history. The fear of the incubus was layered. It was the fear of being paralyzed and suffocated, the fear of sexual assault, the fear of spiritual corruption, and the terrifying fear that such an encounter could leave a woman pregnant with a child born of demonic interference, a living, breathing reminder of her night of terror. If the incubus was the demon of assault, its female counterpart, the succubus, was the demon of seduction. The lore around the succubus is tangled up with medieval anxieties about male piety, lust, and the perceived dangers of female sexuality. A succubus was believed to visit men in their sleep, appearing as a stunningly beautiful woman to seduce them in their dreams. The main evidence of a succubus visit was a very common and natural male experience, a wet dream. In a world where priests were celibate and sex for everyone else was meant only for making children within marriage, any sexual experience outside these rules was filled with spiritual danger. A young man, especially a monk who had taken a vow of celibacy, waking up to find he'd had a sexual dream would be filled with guilt. It was a sign that he had, even unconsciously, given in to lust. The succubus gave him a perfect external explanation. It wasn't his fault, or at least, not his alone. He had been targeted and seduced by a demon while he slept. The stories often paint the succubus as an expert temptress. She could appear as the secret object of a man's desires, whispering promises of pleasure. Famous accounts, like the Temptations of Saint Anthony, are filled with images of beautiful demonic women sent to break his holy resolve. These stories were warnings to all men of faith. Nobody was safe. One 15th century story tells of a young Scottish man who was relentlessly pursued by a female demon. She would appear in his locked room at night, offering to marry him. Terrified, the man went to his bishop, who told him to fast, pray, and confess, which finally made the demon stop tormenting him. The succubus was seen as having two goals. The first, and most obvious, was to damn the man's soul through the sin of lust. By having sex with him, even in a dream, she stained his soul. Each dream was a victory for hell. But the second purpose, according to theologians, was part of that same grim machine of demonic reproduction. The succubus wasn't just seducing men for fun, she was harvesting. She was collecting the raw material, the human semen, that her male incubus form would later use to impregnate a woman. According to this logic, a man's lustful dream was directly connected to a woman's demonic assault somewhere else. The sins of the bedroom were horribly, supernaturally linked. This belief also shows the deep-seated misogyny of the time. While men were often painted as victims of seduction, the succubus herself was a powerful, sexual, and dangerous female figure. This played into a broader cultural fear of female sexuality. A woman who was seen as too desirable or independent could be viewed with suspicion, as if she had the same dangerous, tempting qualities as a demon. This connection would become deadly later, especially during the witch hunts, when the line between a woman being visited by a demon and a woman willingly sleeping with one would become fatally blurred. The most terrifying, real-world consequence of these demonic unions was the possibility of children. What would a child conceived by a human and a demon be like? Medieval lore had a name for such a creature, the Cambion. The word likely comes from the Latin cambiare, meaning to exchange, and in early folklore, it was often used for a changeling, a fairy or demon baby swapped for a human one. Over time, the term also came to describe the direct hybrid offspring of a demon and a mortal. The belief in Cambions brought the abstract fear of demons crashing into the real world. The birth of a Cambion was seen as the ultimate demonic victory. These children were thought to be horrifying monsters, often born with shocking deformities. But their monstrosity wasn't always physical. Some legends describe them as being angelically beautiful, their demonic nature hidden behind a charming face, making them even more dangerous. According to demonology books like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum or the Hammer of Witches, a Cambion might be born without a pulse or the ability to breathe, showing no signs of life until it turns 7. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther spoke of them. He claimed these children were just a mass of flesh without a true soul, and said he had seen one himself that would cry whenever it was touched. He believed these children should be drowned, seeing them as purely demonic. Not all theologians agreed. Of course, some, like Nicholas Remy, rejected the idea of demonic pregnancy altogether, but the fear was widespread. Stories about Cambions often depicted them with huge appetites and evil natures. One 13th-century bishop described them as being thin, always wailing, drinking so much milk that it takes 4 wet nurses to feed one. After years of plaguing the family raising them, they would just vanish. This belief had tragic real-world consequences. It became a supernatural explanation for birth defects and developmental disabilities in an era with no medical understanding of them. A child born with a physical deformity, or a baby who was always sick and cried constantly, could be labeled a Cambion. This brought shame and fear on the family and could put both the mother and child in mortal danger. The mother could be accused of sleeping with a demon, and the child could be seen as a monster that needed to be destroyed. The idea of the Cambion also found its way into literature. Merlin was the most famous heroic example, a Cambion who used his inherited powers for good. But there were others, like Robert the Devil, a knight from a medieval romance whose noble mother, desperate for a child, promised him to the devil. He grows up with superhuman strength and a viciously cruel nature before finally repenting and becoming a holy man. The Cambion represents the ultimate violation, the corruption of birth itself. It's the fear that evil isn't just an external force that attacks us, but something that can be born into the world, to wear a human face and walk among us. Faced with such terrifying threats, what could a medieval person do? Well, they weren't entirely helpless. They had a whole arsenal of spiritual and ritual defenses, known as apotropaic magic, from a Greek word meaning to ward off, designed to protect the home and the soul. These practices were a mix of official church doctrine and old folk traditions, all aimed at turning the bedroom into a sanctuary. The first and most important line of defense was the Christian faith. Prayer was the main weapon. Reciting the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, or certain psalms before sleep was considered a powerful shield. Making the sign of the cross over yourself and your bed was a common practice, believed to create a spiritual barrier that demons couldn't pass. Beyond prayer, physical objects with holy power were key. A crucifix on the wall or worn around the neck was more than a symbol, it was a weapon. Sprinkling holy water around the room was thought to purify the space and repel evil. The relics of saints, even a tiny piece of bone or cloth, were believed to have immense protective power. Folk magic also offered plenty of solutions. Certain herbs were thought to be protective. St. John's wort, for example, was often hung over doorways on St. John's Eve to ward off evil spirits. Placing an open Bible in the room was another common method. Sometimes, even simpler things were used. Iron, especially a horseshoe nailed over a door, was a traditional ward against evil. The belief was that demons couldn't stand the touch of cold iron. A knife placed under the pillow was also thought to offer protection. Even houses themselves could be part of the defense system. In England, strange symbols known as witch marks or apotropaic marks have been found carved into old buildings. These marks were often placed near vulnerable spots like doorways, windows, and fireplaces, anywhere a spirit might sneak in. They took various forms. Sometimes they were letters, like AM for Ave Maria, invoking the Virgin Mary's protection. Other common marks were compass-drawn circles and complex, looping geometric patterns called demon traps. The thinking was that a demon, being a simple-minded creature, would be drawn to the line and have to follow it, getting trapped in the endless pattern forever. One of the most powerful symbols was the pentangle, or five-pointed star, representing the 5 wounds of Christ. At a church in Troston, England, there's a chilling example, a faint carving of a demon's face, with a pentangle deeply carved right over it, as if to pin the demon to the wall and neutralize its power. These defenses show that for medieval people, the fight against demons was a practical, daily chore. The bedroom wasn't just for rest. It had to be spiritually fortified every single night. It's a chilling thought, how a personal terror could become a public weapon. The connection between these bedroom demons and the persecution of real people is one of the darkest parts of this story. If you're finding this dive into the medieval mind as fascinating as I do, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us keep exploring these incredible and often unsettling parts of history. Now, let's see how a private nightmare ended up as evidence in a courtroom. For a long time, an encounter with an incubus or succubus was seen as a personal spiritual struggle, a terrifying trial to be fought with prayer. But around the 14th and 15th centuries, something sinister started to change. The way people interpreted these demonic sexual encounters began to shift. It was no longer just about a demon assaulting an unwilling victim. It was starting to be seen as evidence of a consensual pact. The victim was recast as a willing participant, a witch who had voluntarily given herself to the devil. This change in thinking had catastrophic consequences, especially for women, and it was laid out in one of the most infamous books ever published, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. First published in 1487 by the Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, this book became the go-to handbook for witch hunters. The Malleus is a chilling document, soaked in misogyny and obsessed with the link between female sexuality and demonic evil. Kramer argues that women, because of what he called their insatiable lust and weaker faith, are far more likely to be tempted by the devil. According to the Malleus, the relationship between a witch and a demon was fundamentally sexual. It claimed that for a woman to become a witch, she had to pledge herself to the devil, and this pledge was almost always sealed by sleeping with him. A woman's confession of having sex with a demon, an experience that might have started as a vivid nightmare or sleep paralysis, was now twisted into proof of a diabolical pact. The private terror of the bedroom was dragged into the public square and used as evidence to execute someone. The book details the mechanics of demonic sex. It describes how witches would voluntarily sleep with incubus demons to satisfy their lust. It even addressed male impotence, claiming that witches, with a demon's help, could steal a man's virility or even make it seem like his sexual organs had vanished. These beliefs played on deep-seated male anxieties and placed the blame squarely on women. The result was the horror of the European witch hunts. Tens of thousands of people, most of them women, were accused, tortured, and executed for witchcraft. And at the heart of many of these accusations was the idea of demonic sex. A woman who was old, alone, or just disliked by her neighbors could be accused. Maybe she was a midwife, and a child she delivered was stillborn. Was it a medical tragedy, or had she sacrificed the baby to her demonic lover? The interrogations, which often involved brutal torture, were designed to get a confession that fit the script. Accused women were asked leading questions about their demonic encounters. Under that kind of duress, a terrifying dream could be twisted into a detailed confession of attending a witch's Sabbath, complete with demonic orgies. Scholars have argued that these confessions became so important because they served as expert testimony to the physical reality of demons. In an age of growing skepticism, the lurid accounts of sex with demons, extracted under torture, were presented as undeniable proof that the spiritual world was real. And so, the shadowy figure of the incubus, once a personal demon haunting a victim's sleep, was transformed into a legal and social weapon. The fear of what happened in the bedroom became the justification for persecution and murder on a massive scale. While the demonic explanation had a powerful grip on most people, it's important to remember that the medieval world wasn't a monolith. Even then, there were scholars and physicians who looked for natural, not supernatural, reasons for what happened when people slept. Several medieval medical writers talked about a condition they also called incubus, but they used the term to describe a medical disease, what we would recognize today as sleep paralysis. These physicians, drawing on the classical medical theories of Galen, believed the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was just an imbalance of these humors. According to these medical texts, the suffocating feeling of the incubus wasn't a demon on your chest, but a problem inside your own body. The 13th century physician Arnold of Villanova gave a remarkably insightful description. He explained that during light sleep, when your imagination is still active but your body can't move, vapors could rise from your stomach and mess with your heart and brain. Because the chest and throat feel tight, the sleeper's imagination, trying to make sense of the feeling, conjures the image of something pressing down on them. Another physician, Bernard de Gordon, noted that the common people believed it was a little old woman stomping on them, but he blamed it on things like too much phlegm or even eating the wrong foods before bed. These doctors knew about the demon theory, but they often rejected it. They acknowledged that their patients believed a creature was attacking them, but they saw that belief as a symptom of the illness, not its cause. However, these natural explanations mostly stayed in the world of educated scholars. For most people, the demonic explanation was far more compelling. A story from the 12th century shows this conflict perfectly. A knight complained that he had been attacked by a crushing demon every night for 30 years. He kept his servants nearby to wake him up, even by violently shaking him by his hair. He tried every medical treatment, but nothing worked. Finally, in desperation, he prayed to St. Thomas Becket, who, the story says, miraculously appeared, defeated the demon, and ended the knight's torment forever. This story shows the power of the supernatural framework. While medicine offered theories, faith offered miracles, and a clear story of good versus evil. The treatments were also starkly different. While the church prescribed prayer and exorcism, physicians recommended surprisingly modern-sounding remedies. Bernard de Gordon advised his patients to avoid sadness and live in joy and happiness, suggesting they listen to music or have pleasant conversations with friends to calm the mind, an early form of stress reduction therapy. But for centuries, the demonic explanation remained dominant. It provided a more emotionally satisfying, if terrifying, answer for a deeply mysterious experience. The quiet, rational voice of medieval medicine was, for a long time, drowned out by the thunderous pronouncements of theology. The world of medieval bedroom demons is a dark mirror, reflecting the human psyche. The incubus, the succubus, and the Cambion were more than just monsters. They were the faces given to deep, universal human fears. They were explanations for terrifying and mysterious biological events like sleep paralysis, sexual dreams, and birth defects, all filtered through a worldview where the supernatural was absolutely real. These beliefs show us a society grappling with huge anxieties about sexuality, sin, and the vulnerability of the human soul. The terror of the incubus was the terror of being helpless, of being violated in your most private space. The seduction of the succubus was the fear of desire itself. And the horror of the Cambion was the ultimate fear that this evil could leave a permanent, living stain on the world. Today, science has given us new names for these ancient terrors. The incubus is now rem autonia. A lustful dream is a product of our own subconscious. But taking away the demonic names doesn't completely take away the primal fear. Anyone who has experienced the suffocating grip of sleep paralysis knows the raw terror of the experience, a terror that feels profoundly real, as if some external force is at play. Looking back at these medieval beliefs isn't about looking down on a superstitious past. It's about understanding how we've always tried to make sense of the unknown, especially the unknown parts of our own minds and bodies. The demons of the medieval bedroom show us that for centuries, the greatest monsters weren't in distant lands. They were the ones waiting for us in the darkness of our own rooms, in the vulnerable moments of sleep, reminding us that sometimes The most terrifying frontier is the one that lies within.